Do you feel that let's talk about anti-racism for 1 second in this context. Do you feel that the vague nature of the anti-racism movement and sentiment, do you feel like that's intentional, or do you feel like that's just kind of a shortcoming? And the reason I ask it in that context is this disconnection between social justice and economic justice. Likewise, do
Right.
you feel like that's intentional, or is it just a failing of this identity politics era that we've evolved into?
Wow, that's a tough question. In fact, I was going to apologize about the last segment too, because I was going to say that I got a feeling that you asked me what time it is, and I told you how to make a watch. But
No, go for
uh,
it.
no, that's a really tough one. I mean, I think the real answer is some of all of the above,
Hmm.
right? I've also taken like in recent years to quoting a statement from Upton Sinclair that it's very difficult to convince a man to believe something when his living depends on him not believing it.
Mm.
And my father had a quip too that was like a definition of what um, ideology is in the one Marxist sense. And he said that ideology is the mechanism that harmonizes the principles that you want to believe that you hold with what advances your material interest in the world,
Mm.
right? So, and the reciprocal of that aphorism that he always mentioned, I can hear his voice ringing in my head saying this all the time, that sincerity is vastly overrated as a political virtue. And he'd say, for instance, depending on how he felt, which day, I mean, which case he would cite, but Himmler was very sincere, right? So the problem isn't that Himmler wasn't sincere. The problem is what Himmler was sincere about doing,
Mm.
and and what he genuinely considered would make the world a better place. So that said, I came along like in the poverty program era, right? And I got to watch that, those dynamics up close and personal too,
Hmm.
right? And like I said, a whole lot of of being able to figure stuff out in this world doesn't have to do with being smart. It's got more to do with keeping your eyes open and paying attention to what's
Mm.
going on in concrete ways. And I mean, there there's a notion of what it means to be an activist.
Hmm.
First of all, that's evolved over recent decades, right? Some of it has its roots, like in the emergence of what's now called identity politics, in the academy over the late '80s, '90s, whatever. So people genuinely believe that they are trying to make the world a better place, and they're trying to fight oppression and like inequality and injustice. One name that comes to mind is DeRay McKesson,
Hmm.
right? I'm sure that DeRay McKesson sincerely believes that charter schools, as he said, are one of the most phenomenal innovations of recent decades. I suspect he believes that partly because he doesn't know any better. He believes that because it's in his material interest not to know any better. He was a TFA functionary, right? And the nice thing about um, blackness as a political position is that it can encompass anything, right? I mean, this is another lesson that one could have just from having been around the Black Power era and the forms of radicalism that emerged out of Black Power, right? I mean, um, racial authenticity. First of all, it doesn't exist, right? Right. That's the first point, right? There's no such thing as racial authenticity because a claim always provokes or should provoke, according to whom, right? I
Right.
mean, who says
Right.
who, who is the arbiter of what counts as racial authenticity? Um, um, you know, um, I, I was on a panel at Yale that the Black Graduate Students Group organized in the mid '80s, and there was a panel on it was not long after my book on the Jesse Jackson phenomenon came out, and it was a panel on the role of the Black Church
Right.
in Black politics. And one of the moderators said to me at one point, kind of snidely, that I didn't really understand the black church because I didn't come up in the black church, because I, like a whole lot of other black people, like in South Louisiana, as well as, by the way, Cuba, Brazil, Venezuela, Dominica, was raised Catholic, right? So somehow, right, that's not authentically black,
Yeah, yeah.
right? But so that just throws into relief like the folly of all that kind of stuff. But when it gets to politics, then it's really ultimately a class politics, right? Because in the first place, nationalism, like, is always the ideology of the bourgeoisie and the professional and the managerial strata whose fantasies are that they'll be able to run stuff, right? But coming down from from that plane of sort of high dogma, if not high theory, what's appealing about racial authenticity as the metric of political legitimacy is that if you who can most effectively press claims to be the authentic spokesperson. I mean, like I've been asking the whole time I've been teaching, how does one get to be a black leader, right? There's never been a job description written for it, right? So, but when you think about it historically, like, the job was invented by and for Booker T. Washington, right? There was no such thing as a black leader or a Negro leader before Washington. I mean, not even Douglas. Partly because black people voted and had civic voice on their own. But the answer to the question how one gets to be a black leader has always been the same. You get to be a black leader by being recognized as a black leader by powerful white people. So that's where the racial authenticity gets you, which is the irony of it all, right?
Yeah.
But so now, though, with the insidious role of, in fact, I was at a dissertation defense in my department yesterday afternoon, but the student wrote a very good, good dissertation on bogus reforms in the juvenile justice system around the country. Right? She took 3 state cases and built out from that. But one of the things that she found is that, and presumably viewers who work in this area know this, but that the Annie Casey Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation are deeply entrenched in sustaining, supporting, reproducing, shaping, like, a layer of so-called community-based organizations and nonprofits all over the country that provide careers and career ladders for people, many of whom genuinely believe that what they're doing is working for reform to make things better. Because we've also had the evolution over the last 20 years of bogus notions like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, to which I always respond by saying, well, don't let what's possible blind you to what's actually necessary, right? Because it may not be the same thing.
Right.
And like, this has gone on like in the housing area. John David Arena did a great book called Driven from New Orleans on the ongoing attack, the 40-year attack on the public housing in the city of New Orleans, which is also driven partly by community-based groups, basically, that are funded by and thus accountable to bigger foundations and nonprofits who represent themselves and are represented as the authentic voices of the community, right? So they're just kind of layers of this insidious dynamic of neoliberal social administration that's also a form of race relations administration that it would be important for us to unpack. And it's much more complex than can be captured by simplistic analogies like the Jim Crow or to slavery, right? So I feel like I've given another speech on how to make white.